Good evening, Fresno Audubon. Thanks so much for the intro, Rick. I'm glad to be here. I think I've presented for Fresno in the past, but I'm certainly happy to be back in this capacity. Alrighty, well, tonight we are talking about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, California native plants and some of our native birds. And we'll be talking about an ecosystem-based approach to gardening for native species. This presentation will be around 45 or 50 minutes, and it'll have a couple different sections. The first one is a little bit of indigenous history in California, and then the second section will be about kind of how to set up a garden to support local wildlife, including birds, and then we'll have a kind of local birds that are possible in backyards and things like that. And then we'll take a Q&A section at the very end of the presentation. So if you have questions that come up during this talk, feel free to throw it in the chat and we'll get into it in the Q&A time. Alrighty. So I'll share just a tiny bit about myself. My name is Benny Jacobs-Schwartz, or Benny Isaac Jacobs-Schwartz, which is where the BIJS comes from. And I started my business a couple years ago. And when I first started birdwatching, I was often the youngest person by a long shot, which I thought was a shame because I think birding is obviously very fun and interesting. And I was like, I need to reach people in my age group so they can get excited about birds and conservation, because I thought there was a huge disconnect between those demographics and birding. And so I was like, how do I reach people like me? And so I started kind of putting together some nature-inspired clothing and using some eye-catching graphics to hopefully stir people's curiosity and let them ask me what all this stuff is about, as opposed to me kind of proselytizing my birding obsession, which gets old pretty quickly for non-birders. So that's one of the aspects of my business. Another one is I offer local bird and ecology walks. And the third thing that I do is I run international birding tours. So feel free to check those out on my website. And alrighty, so tonight's talk is all about native plants as a foundation for supporting local ecosystems. And one of the things that I see so often when talking about native plants is the absence of any conversation around indigenous people, right? Indigenous plants, indigenous people, they've existed in California and North America for thousands of years, but it's very uncommon that indigenous people are talked about in this capacity, which I think is a shame. And so I wanted to kind of shed some light on it. So here is a really cool resource. It's native-land.ca, and you can zoom in to wherever you live and see what tribal lands you're located on. Where I live in Los Angeles is on Tongva land, or the Gabrielinos. And as you can see, there's quite a variety of different bands and tribes. And here's a different graphic showing just how diverse the language, families, and tribal boundaries are in California. I'm not sure. I wonder if you guys are like Northern Sierra Miwok or something like that. Maybe I'm not far enough north or too far north, but at any rate, you can check it out on here. And I think it's also really cool to think about how diverse indigenous languages are in California and how that corresponds to California's overall biodiversity, which is obviously something we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And one of the books that I found most interesting by a long shot in regards to native plants and something called traditional ecological knowledge was this compendium. It's an incredible resource. It's so deep and comprehensive and mind-blowing. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Tending the Wild. And this book explores how California Indians managed economies that occupied this middle portion of the continuum, as opposed to like exploitation or just like straight farming. It also recast them as active agents of environmental change and stewardship, shattering the hunter-gatherer stereotype long perpetuated in anthropological and historical literature of California. And as I'm sure a lot of folks are aware, there's a large movement to, like, I guess, give a louder voice and invite indigenous groups to the table, especially when it comes to land conservation and land management. And so here's a photograph up in Yurok, up in Northern California. This is a Yurok tribal member meeting with some land managers to help integrate their traditional ecological knowledge to help support regenerative ecosystem practices. And for those folks who are unfamiliar, California Indians, and this is in the past tense because their former status has changed a lot, but California Indians are very much still here and present throughout the state. California Indians protected and tended favored plant species and habitats, harvested plant and animal products at carefully worked out frequencies and intensities, and practiced an array of horticultural techniques. Through coppicing, pruning, harrowing, sowing, weeding, burning, digging, thinning, and selective harvesting, they encouraged desired characteristics of individual plants, increased populations of useful plants, and altered the structures and compositions of plant communities. One example is through regular burning, in which many types of vegetation across the state are improved for better habitat for game. It eliminated brush, minimized the potential for catastrophic fires, and encouraged a diversity of food crops. These harvest and management practices, on the whole, allowed for sustainable harvest of plants over centuries and possibly thousands of years. Another example of integration of indigenous management and land back is this Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary off the Central Coast here in San Luis Obispo County. So for folks that probably are aware, marine protected areas have a plethora of benefits, specifically for fisheries as well as all marine life, but there's strict regulations. They're basically marine national parks with strict fishing regulations and things like that. So obviously indigenous people in California have been dispossessed of much of their land, and to even get national recognition as a tribe requires a lot of work, and there are many tribes and bands that don't have that luxury. So this was a petition to help support it. This was a little bit ago. I'm not sure if the petition's still open, but that being said, and here's another example of centering native plants around native peoples. This is called the Cultural Fire Management Council. This is up also in Yurok Reservation ancestral lands. And there's a whole fire crew that does cultural burns to facilitate the practice on Yurok Reservation and ancestral lands, which will lead to a healthier ecosystem for all plants and animals, long-term fire protection for residents, and provide a platform that will in turn support traditional hunting and gathering activities of the Yurok Indians. All right, so right now we are in the Anthropocene, like the 6th mass extinction. I'm sure many of us get emails from beloved conservation orgs, Center for Biological Diversity, wildlife defenders, things like that, and that we are losing biodiversity at unprecedented rates. And in modern times, the primary way that we've responded to this loss of biodiversity and habitat degradation is by basically setting aside land as a preserve and basically just like closing it off from human interactions. And the assumptions behind this strategy are apparent in the way that we define wilderness, right? In kind of a modern context, wilderness essentially means places that are untouched by people. They're unspoiled. But in most indigenous cultures in California, wilderness, and I think for us, it has a positive connotation that it's serene and it's, you know, it's incredible. But in many indigenous cultures, the idea of wilderness more or less kind of reflected an idea of unkemptness and unmanaged. And indigenous peoples have been actively managing the landscape for thousands of years in North America. And in California, this is an excerpt from Tending the Wild, which talks about some of our most vulnerable and important ecosystems in California. And so the darker section of these horizontal bar charts indicates the percentage of remaining area in California. And so as you can see, we've lost a lot of our coastal salt marshes, maybe only 30 or 40% remain. And you can see each of these different categories, with alkali sink scrub in SoCal as one of the most impacted ecosystems. And the reason I share this is because due to the dispossession of indigenous people from their lands, there has been a massive exploitation of what we call natural resources, whether it's food or whether it's, animals for hunting, timber for harvesting, things like that. And it turns out that indigenous communities protect about 80% of global biodiversity. And this is from the World Bank via Australia back in 2021. And here's another citation around this topic from the World Wildlife Foundation, which quotes Dr. Sina, recognizing indigenous people's land rights and consequently 80% of global biodiversity should be placed at the center of present and future global challenges. So I think a lot of people, think that technology is going to free us from what's going on, but, modern people have really only existed in North America for a couple hundred years or so. And I think it's quite apparent what the consequences of the way we've been living are. And it would only seem natural that folks who have been existing here for thousands of years might have a thing or two to share. So that's that. That's all I'll share in that regard for now. So the next thing that I wanted to draw our attention to is this map of California broken out into different ecoregions within the California floristic province. So this is obviously California broken out into these different ecotypes. And here's each of the keys for each of these regions within the floristic province. And as you can see, just by the sheer variety and color, California has an extremely wide variety of ecosystems, from the Central Valley to the highest peaks in the Sierra to the Eastern Sierra. You can experience a wide range of birds and plant communities, which is just, more or less on like a horizontal axis. So if you'd gone from the southeastern deserts up through the Central Valley into the Sierra and up into northwest part of California, you would see a tremendous diversity. So, and that's because California is home to about 5,500 native plants, and roughly 2,400 of those species are endemic, meaning they're only found in California, which is why California has its own floristic province, because it's so unique in relation to much of North America. So the next section is we're going to identify a couple classifications of plants. The first one is pretty straightforward. Trees are, and these are botanical terms, trees are a woody perennial plant, typically having a single stem or trunk growing to a considerable height, generally 20 feet or higher, and bearing lateral branches at some distance from the ground. So in California, we have over 200 species of trees that are native, everything from Fremont cottonwood to western sycamore and hollyleaf cherry. And the next category in terms of height are shrubs. These are woody plants, which are smaller than a tree and have several main stems arising at or near the ground. And these plants are generally 20 feet or lower. And we have about 1,500 species of shrubs native to California. Shrubs are synonymous with chaparral, foothill plant communities, which I believe occupy about 40% of terrestrial ecosystem types in California. So the chaparral is incredible and amazing, as I'm sure many of you know living in Fresno. It's not very far away. But we have all different types, everything from western redbud to, various ceanothus, sages, and things like that. So a lot to work with when we're thinking about landscaping our gardens or open spaces. So then we'll get into annuals. So this is basically any plant that completes its life cycle in a single growing season. So we have about 2,200 annuals that are native to California. We have a variety of lupins, wildflowers like goldfields, California bluebell, these sunflowers, a wide variety. This is just a quick sampling. And then we also have perennials, so plants that basically persist for several years and they never lose their above ground terrestrial tissue. And we have about 3,700 different species of perennial plants native to California, everything from succulents like this chalk dudleya to cliff maize, this yerba mansa, which is found in wet areas, Acacia formosa, western columbine, scarlet monkeyflower, a wide variety. And in some cases, some annuals, depending on where they're found and the climate that they're in, can actually persist year-round. Some penstemons do that as well, like are displayed here, as well as California poppy in some places can be a perennial. And then we get into grasses, which are typically the most challenging to identify to species, but they're mostly found in the family Gramiea or Poaceae, and they're monocots, having narrow leaves, hollow stems, and clusters of very small, usually wind-pollinated flowers. And this is probably the group of plants that gets talked about least in California. And we have 644 species of grasses that are native to our state. And we'll talk a little bit more about grasses later, but I just wanted to like bring this to our attention because they're often not talked about at all. And in most cases have been our bunch grasslands have been severely degraded due to arrival of European invasive grasses over the last couple hundred years. Getting into succulents, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a succulent is. You can buy one at Trader Joe's and the market. And we have about 188 succulents that are native to California. Giant coreopsis, interestingly enough, is identified as a succulent, but we have, you know, a lot of different cactuses. We have these agaves, like Joshua tree or Perry's nolina, coastal cholla, stonecrop, Mojave yucca. There's a lot. All right, vines, plants that basically grow on top of other plants and have twining tendrils. And there's a lot of different ones as well. Surprisingly, 92 different species. We have a variety of different morning glories. We have blackberries, California grape, Dutchman's pipe, wild cucumber. There's quite a few. And then ferns. So these are non-flowering plants that have herbaceous vascular, they're herbaceous vascular plants, and they do have true roots and stems and complex leaves, which is the opposite of a simple leaf, which is just kind of one complete shape. Ferns have complex leaves, or there's a whole different set of botanical terms, but they reproduce by spores, which are found on the underside of these leaves. And we have over 100 different species of ferns that are native to California. Everything from the massive giant chain fern and the large sword fern to the really delicate California maidenhair fern, and so much in between. Alrighty, so one of my favorite ecosystems is the chaparral. It is fascinating to me, and it's also one of the closest ecosystems to where I live. And some of the things, and this is just kind of a case study for California native plants and how incredibly adapted they are to life in California. One of the things in chaparral plants is they have something called sclerophyllous leaves, which are basically thick and waxy, and they help prevent evapotranspiration. And chaparral plants have deep taproots to help prevent erosion. They're adapted to periodic fires with, you know, intervals between 90 and 120 years. And they also create microclimates for moisture retention and animal protection. And they're extremely resilient. Chaparral temperatures can fluctuate, you know, annually between freezing snow and blistering heat in the triple digits. So that by itself is mind-blowing to me, that they don't, you know, they can't put on a jacket, they don't light a fire. They just are so well adapted that they can just persist even after being snowed on and then 100-degree plus days in the summer. And one thing that's really interesting that kind of changed my mindset around chaparral was that it's basically like a bonsai forest, because the plants are effectively having the same role in the ecosystem that a quote unquote traditional or a large hardwood forest might have, but this is just happening at a much smaller scale in terms of height. And then the last thing is, of course, they produce fruits, flowers, seeds for birds and local wildlife. I'm sure if you've been on the trail in the backcountry, or you've probably seen manzanita berries or coffee berries and things like that in coyote or fox or bear scat, etc. And another thing that's cool about chaparral plants is they flower during the cooler, wetter months. So here in Southern California, we're moving into kind of like our springtime. In about a month, a lot of our chaparral plants will be blooming, which is really cool. And obviously, as you get into higher elevation in the Sierra, summer doesn't hit there till basically June once the snow melts. And again, chaparral plants provide entire ecosystem function, right? It's not just for the birds. The birds are absolutely inextricably linked to the food web. And as you can see here, there's a hermit thrush feeding on laurel sumac. This was a flower cluster that was pollinated and then went to seed and is basically a little bird feeder. So birds, everybody's in Fresno Audubon because they like birds. And birds are universal communicators, whether it's you're studying bird language in the hopes of learning how to track better, or you're surveying ecosystems using surveying ecosystems for birds during breeding season. The diversity of birds in an ecosystem tells us the overall health of the ecosystem, right? Birds are in the what we call mid-trophic, meaning that they're not apex predators like mountain lions, nor are they at the bottom of the food web like phytoplankton, but they're right in the middle. So when the food web is tugged or pulled in a different direction or things become out of balance, you see that reflected pretty quickly in the diversity of the bird community. And native plants are incredible. Like I said, they're super resilient and they're becoming extremely trendy, which I'm super grateful for, because obviously most residential homes in suburban and urban areas feature almost exclusively exotic plants. So the whole point of this presentation is to create micro ecosystems with native plants that can serve as a seed bank for restoring other areas, as well as helping create pockets of ecological resilience and microhabitats for native animals, including birds. So here's a photo of a Williamson sapsucker feeding on some coffee berry, which was cool because this was a rare bird that showed up in San Luis Obispo. And the habitat is so incredible in this spot in Montaña de Oro State Park. And there's some awesome large coffee berry bushes, which were a treat for this sapsucker. So today we're talking about attracting birds to the garden, right? Everybody wants to bird watch from home. Who wouldn't? And one thing that I think is important to think about is the relationship, right? How do you support birds having a successful experience in your garden? That's a little bit weird wording, but how do you set up your yard so that you get a lot of birds? Well, a lot of it is thinking about habitat, a lot of it thinking about water, a lot of thinking about food, shelter, things like that. And this is a good example of relationships in the ecosystems, right? We have a Scots oriole here and a Joshua tree. Both of these individual species have been existing with each other probably for thousands of years. And like I said, we're talking about an ecosystem-based approach. We're not talking about just protecting one species. We're talking about creating ecological resilience through native plants, and insects are an integral part of that story. So where I live in Los Angeles and where most people live is in urban spaces. And my goal here is to help create habitat connectivity between these large open spaces and where urban populations and suburban populations are not starting, but basically create they contribute to habitat degradation and they disconnect ecosystems, right? We can see downtown Los Angeles, and then we can also see like this super dense area of houses in the East Bay in San Francisco. And this a lot of this used to be salt marsh, which has been severely destroyed. So that's the goal of my work tonight, is to help encourage folks to feel confident and excited about at least starting with like a small section of their yard, or maybe a conservation org that they're working with to help restore the ecosystem to its prior glory. And the birds have felt this dramatic degradation of our landscape, because this is from about 2019, but we'd lost almost 3 billion birds since 1970, and basically almost 30% loss in migratory species since 1970. And there's a lot of reasons that go into this, you know, outdoor cats, building collisions, habitat loss and degradation, a variety of things. And we'll get to some of those things a little bit later. And that being said, I wanted to also introduce a concept that a lot of people don't think so much about in my experience, a lot of people know that birds migrate, obviously. That's not super complex of an idea. But what I think is really complex is how varied these migration routes are from species to species, from spring to fall. And I also think it's fantastically interesting that some birds winter in Hawaii and breed in Alaska. Some birds breed in Alaska and winter in Argentina. And they fly thousands of miles, sometimes through the open ocean nonstop, but in many cases they fly through our primary flyways, the Pacific Flyway, the Central Flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, and forget what this one's called, the Eastern Flyway, I guess. And along the way, they're stopping over in these habitats. And many of the birds that breed in North America only spend maybe 1/3 of their year with us. And they spend 2/3 of the year either in migration or on their wintering grounds. And so one thing that I've been sharing with Audubon chapters that I think is really cool is to partner with local conservation orgs along these flyways, because if we're only protecting and conserving land where we live, that's only one side of the coin in terms of conserving bird species. So just wanted to introduce that idea and share how fascinatingly complex these migration stories are. So let's get into some plants. I'm a huge native plant fan, and one of my favorite resources is a website called Calscape. It's a little bit cut off here, but Calscape is a really cool tool. There's so many things you can do on here. It's kind of like eBird for plant lovers. And first thing when you're planting your garden is to think about where you live, right? Like we looked on that map before, and you can see that these ecosystems are very different from the west side to the Sierra, the east side Sierra, the coastal range, the interior coastal range, mountains. Like it's not a one size fits all situation in California at all. So I typed in just like a random town near here, Simi Valley, and you can basically check and see what plants are native to your location. Because beyond being native in terms of plants, we want to think about regionally appropriate plants that have traditionally existed in this area and are quote unquote supposed to be here. I see a lot of people, bringing plants from the Channel Islands and they're planting all these different places. Like that's fine, but really, if you want to support the ecosystem, and the first step is bringing the insects in, right, to pollinate and feed on the plants, which then provide food for birds and other animals, is planting plants that are literally from this area, because the insects will return to them very quickly. So you can type in your address or your city or whatever, and you can check out all these different plants that grow near you. And one that I love is Toyon, and you can click through, you can see different photos of it in different parts of its life cycle. You can also see its range in California. You can learn a bit about its plant type, its growth rate, watering, flowering season, like all the info is in here. This is for cultivation and propagation, and it's an amazing tool. So we'll circle back to a little bit more stuff from Calscape a little bit later. But next up, we're going to talk a little bit about birds of California. So we've seen about 701 species of birds have been observed in California on eBird. Maybe that number is a little bit higher, but California is only second to Texas in the US for diversity. So it's number 2. And California is not immune to environmental degradation. In fact, it's one of the most degraded and manipulated landscapes in North America. It's changed dramatically in the last couple hundred years. And with those changes have also resulted in changes in bird populations. And now we have about 16 species that are listed as state endangered. Everything from the California condor to the bald eagle, I think, is still on this list. California least tern, elf owl, great gray owl, and several more subspecies. And then we have about 8 state threatened species: the Swainson's hawk, California black rail, Yuma's ridgeway rail, greater sandhill crane, Scripps murrelet, Guadalupe murrelet, northern spotted owl, and bank swallow. So let's talk about getting birds in our garden or attracting them to open spaces. And here's California scrub jay with an arroyo willow. And here's a hermit thrush with some yummy toyon berries. So these are all birds that can show up in gardens and open spaces, including red-tailed hawk. Here's a red-shouldered hawk, often heard before seen, that keer, keer, keer call, calling from oak woodlands and things like that. This is a Cooper's hawk. This is almost an adult bird, if not completely adult. And I'm sure, folks, if you have a bird feeder or a bird bath, these guys and gals love to frequent yards. They feed on small songbirds and sometimes small mammals as well, but they really specialize in songbirds. Another bird that's common in a lot of California and can easily show up in your yard is a northern flicker. These guys specialize in ants, but they are mostly seen in trees, but they also come down to the ground to feed on ants. Pileated woodpecker, depending on what type of backyard situation you have, those can show up as well. Nuttall's woodpecker, this is a common oak woodland species, even though they don't feed on acorns, which is really interesting. Allen's hummingbird, this is a pretty common SoCal hummingbird species. I'm not sure how far north its range is. I know it goes to the Central Coast, but I'm not sure if it's in Fresno County. And then Anna's hummingbird is our classic year-round hummingbird in California with the bright pink kind of fuchsia gorget and iridescent crown. Here's another side profile look at the Anna's hummingbird perched on mule fat, which is very closely related to coyote brush. Another hummingbird species we have in California is the Costa's hummingbird. It's got a purple gorget instead of a fuchsia one, and it's a little bit smaller. Another one that can show up in our backyards during migration in the summer is the ash-throated flycatcher. This is a large flycatcher, and here it is feeding on a native moth. This is a white-lined sphinx moth, which buzzes around and feeds on nectar from flowers, very similar to a hummingbird. Probably the most common backyard bird we see is the black phoebe. These are year-round residents. They're flycatchers. They're tyrant flycatchers, and they're a really cool study bird because they're not particularly shy, and you can observe their behavior for quite a long time. Another awesome bird that can show up in backyards, depending on where you live and whose range is moving north and north, is the handsome vermilion flycatcher. Very similar to the black phoebe and the Say's phoebe. This is a really cool year-round resident in some places and then shows up in mass in lowland and foothill communities in the winter. This is the ruby-crowned kinglet foraging in a coast live oak. Here is another migratory songbird. This is the Nashville warbler. As you can see, it's got a complete white eye ring, a gray head, and a mostly yellow body with kind of some yellow olive wings and yellow undertail coverts. And this bird was photographed in San Diego in the mountains, foraging for insects on some willow. Another very common winter resident in the lowlands is the yellow-rumped warbler, and here it is feeding on some poison oak berries from the season prior. Another warbler that we get a lot in the winter and also that breeds up in the Pine Mountains is Townsend's warbler, and this is actually on coyote brush this time. Another insectivore is the blue-gray gnatcatcher. These tiny little birds are often hard to get on as they flit around and obscure themselves in the vegetation. And this guy is perched on another native plant. This is big saltbush. And again, another very common, but nonetheless cute bush tit foraging for aphids and things like that in this western sycamore. House wren, you can hear their bubbly, warm songs in this emanating from woodlands and oak woodlands in the spring, and this is also a very common bird and throughout much of its range. Here's a spotted towhee belting out its song in the early morning in spring. Black-headed grosbeaks will often show up if you have jelly set up on feeders or you have fruiting trees that produce small berries. They're a big fan. House finch. This bird goes without saying. I'm sure every single person has seen a house finch. They're really cool. And their color, the brightness of their color is actually determined by the quality of their diet. So birds that feed a lot on wild, colorful berries, things like elderberries that have a lot of color pigments in there, tend to be the brightest. And the brightest, most colorful birds are indicating a lot to a female because, like I said, their coloration, these colors, reds and oranges and things like that, are attributed to their diet. From the reds come from a compound called beta carotenoids, and so the healthier a bird is, the brighter it's going to look. And so a female bird could see that coloration, like the brighter the bird, she could determine that it is good at finding food. It knows its habitat well. A, that it can find food, and B, that it can also avoid predators. And the fact that it's so colorful and still alive means that it is, good at escaping and aware of its surroundings. All really good indicators that it would be a strong father. So there's a lot that you can tell just by looking at a bird's color. And obviously female birds can see very subtle differences in these things that might escape us. Another very common and often referred to as a little brown bird, this is the California towhee. These guys love eating seeds, so things like sages and things like that will drop seeds are a great match for towhees. Here's a fox sparrow doing just that, cracking seeds that have fallen from a laurel sumac above it and feeding. Next up is lesser goldfinch, again feeding on laurel sumac. Getting into a song sparrow, common in kind of moist as well as wetland adjacent areas. White crowned sparrow, very common in the winter in the lowlands and breeds up in the higher elevations during the summer. Mourning doves, a dime a dozen. They're quite stunning if you give them the time. They love eating seeds as well. California quail have a kind of a diverse diet. Sometimes they eat leaves, seeds, small insects, and occasionally consume berries. Western bluebirds love worms and insects as well as berries. California thrasher is another chaparral all-star. It's got this long decurved beak, long tail, beautiful song, and they thrash around in the understory between leaves and the duff looking for seeds and insects. Wren tit is probably the first bird that we hear when we enter the chaparral, aka the ping pong bird, and these guys generally are insectivorous. Another neotropical migrant is the hooded oriole. These guys often nest in palm trees in California and are very site loyal, so they'll return to the same area that they're breeding in year after year, and they like insects as well as fruit, and as you can see, they're quite colorful. Costa's hummingbird, again, foraging on some tuberosa, I think. So that was just a quick selection of some of the kind of layup birds, I would say, that can show up in your yards once you start transforming them to support native birds and native wildlife. So when we get into plant selection, there's like a lot of things to think about, which is what we're going to talk about next, like designing the garden. So a couple of things that you want to think about is creating texture and dimension, creating a color palette, and thinking about year-round activity. So a couple of the common mistakes are the collector's garden, having too many different species and not narrowing it down. Another common mistake is overplanting, as folks have probably seen a baby oak tree versus an adult oak tree. They take up a very different amount of space depending on the age. And the same thing is true for many plants as they grow and bush out and get a lot bigger. Another common mistake is that people don't create enough contrast between the plants and they all just kind of blend together into a sea of similar shapes. And this is talking about kind of from an aesthetic standpoint as well as function. And then another common mistake is people just design by flower color and they don't think about the bones of the garden, which is what we'll talk about in a little bit. And then a common mistake is that they just will put a plant in the ground and they aren't really paying attention to the conditions that it needs, whether it's the amount of sunlight, the temperature threshold that it does best in, it's the amount of water that it likes, and the type of soil that it grows best in. And speaking about watering, another common mistake is mixing different hydrozones, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then another common mistake is you put the plants in and you just let it go, which, again, as we talked about, plants like to be maintained. They like to be pruned back in the winter, every couple of years, things like that. So those are probably the most common mistakes people make when they're working in their gardens. And then we'll get into some design concepts. So some of the concepts that work really well are the rule of odd numbers, massing, layering, repetition, providing contrast, thinking about function. And thinking about function. So the rule of odd numbers, that one's obviously specific. Massing is the process in which you plant 3 or 4 or 5 plants in a group together and forming a community, as opposed to just row of plants. You're kind of diversifying the way you do it and planting what we also call like companion planting, plants that grow well with one another for a variety of reasons. Another thing is layering, right? So if you're looking at your garden, your open space from the front walking in, you don't want to have all these tall plants that are going to shade and obscure the view of shorter plants that you have. So it's best to like plant in layers with short, medium, and tall in that order. And then repetition, which is a cool theme. So maybe you have, a walkway and then a side area that has some of these same principles in terms of plants. And so it creates a nice aesthetic. And then again, contrasting, I think goes hand in hand with layering. So you want to get some plants that have like a sycamore shape, and then like a smaller plant shape that can grow under it, that is shade tolerant, that loves water but also has a different look. So that's just one example. As you saw, there's literally thousands of plants and many different combinations and things to think about. And then for function, right? So when we're talking about for year-round activity, we don't want to just plant all annuals in our yard, because those resources are only going to be really available during part of the year. So it's best to plant species that are going to have year-round activity, some that flower in June, some that flower in March, some that produce berries in the summer, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's get into hydrozoning. So the idea behind hydrozoning is basically breaking out your irrigation and dividing it into different sections based on the water needs of plants. So this is a very simple diagram, but it's a pretty simple concept. So zone 1 basically is infrequent or no watering. Zone 2 is occasional watering, and zone 3 is regular or weekly watering. So some people aren't super like hardcore. They don't want to rip out all their plants. Maybe they have some older trees. Maybe they have some things that they really like in the garden, and they don't want to, go like pure hardcore native plant landscape, which makes total sense. But oftentimes what will happen is in like zone 3, you'll have plants here that are like that love like really well draining soil, like they don't like their roots to be very wet. And then you have other plants that were already in this plot, and they're thirsty, they're exotic, they're not from here, they're not adapted to this hot climate and cool winters, and they're super thirsty. And so if you don't think about it, you can basically be wasting money by putting plants just because you want them to go here, you think they would look good here, when they actually aren't fitting in with the water needs of your existing plants or other plants that you put in here. So effective hydrozoning will maximize plant success as well as ensure that your plants aren't over or underwatered. And the cool thing about California native plants is basically after about 1 year, you can wean them completely off of any supplemental watering and irrigation. You can just shut it off, and that's pretty amazing. So no more of these like sterile, exotic, succulent gardens with gravel rocks. Like that is so out. California native plant gardens that perform year-round ecosystem services and serve as habitat are so in. All right, so getting into some of these like design concepts. So bones, this is really simple. They're basically hardscaping or components of your yard or open space that are bold and draw the eye. And they also provide a lot of contrast, right? So you can see we have some blue-eyed grass here, Cicerynchium bellum. We have California native poppies. Not sure what this is. We have some California native grasses here. We have some like sulfur buckwheat. We have some sage in the background. And then we have this awesome, like looks like Flagstaff walkway with a little greenhouse, and then some, rocks interspersed in here to provide a little bit of kind of topographic contrast. And then bones don't just have to be like hardscaping. Like I said, they can also be large objects like that greenhouse, or they can also be plants with good structure like this manzanita that's been pruned really nicely. So those are things to think about, bones. The next thing are what we call guts. These are basically hardworking perennials that show up day in and day out, and they show up to work every day. And there are a lot of perennials. I think there was like, I don't know, more than 1,000 in California. So there's a lot to choose from. And this is an example of an annual / perennial, this California poppy, depending on where you live. And then we have this stunning elegant Clarkia here, just as a couple examples of how beautiful you can make your native plant garden. So the skin. So this is basically the ground cover. This ties it all together. And here, one of my favorite plants is yarrow, Achillea millifolum. And then it looks like we have maybe Cleveland sage or purple sage here, and then some more bunch grasses. And so these are incredible. These are highly medicinal plants. You can see thousands of bugs coming to pollinate the yarrow, and each of these flower heads have several like small flowers here. So there's a lot of different things to choose from. Yarrow, maybe that's coyote mint actually. And then another example of skin is this ceanothus. This is a varietal or a horticultural kind of, this is a native plant, but it's been altered a little bit for certain characteristics. And in this case, the characteristic that it's been altered for is like these dark blue purple flowers, as well as a prostrate growth type. And what that means is that it basically grows on the ground. Now, I generally prefer using like natural or wild genetics, in the sense that I don't like cultivars as much, but there are some cases where I think it's fine. But if we really want to do the best we can, getting like natural genetics that aren't cultivars, I think are probably the strongest approach. And then accents. So something that's going to draw your eye. And one of the most common things for accents are water features, which double as excellent ways to attract birds to your garden, and they create, a beautiful relaxing sound if you don't live near somewhere where you can hear water running. So there's a lot of different things you can do to accent your garden, but water features are a really good one, especially when we're talking about birds. So before you go and dump a bunch of money or time into modifying an open space or working on a native plant garden, there's a lot of things that you should take into consideration, like we talked about, right? If you're not planting the plants, if you're not reviewing the conditions that your plants need and the places and the conditions in the space that you want to plant, you're not going to set yourself up for success. And so one of the ways that there's a couple of ways that you can address this, one of which is going for soil tests. So this is a composition. This is a simple soil test where you basically dig down so you can see what your soil horizons look like. And the first one is the O horizon, which is basically loose and partly decayed organic matter, O for organic. Then we get into A horizon, which is like mineral matter mixed with some humus or decomposed organic matter. Then we get into E horizon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some plants, like I said, like really fast draining soil, which is like often gravel or sand. And some plants do not tolerate clay soil. So really, depending on where you are, and doing a soil test is a great way to check out what's going on in the soil. So another way to do a soil test is through the ribbon test. And so basically you just moisten a bit of soil in your hand and you roll it into a tube, and then you squeeze that ribbon upwards between your thumb and forefinger, and you basically try and get it to go as far out as possible, forming the longest, thinnest ribbon. And what that does is it basically, where it breaks off is where you measure it. So if you have a really clay heavy soil, you can see that you're going to get a long ribbon of soil. Clay loam, it gets shorter, loam even shorter, sandy loam even shorter, and then loamy sand. So mostly sand with like a little bit of like organic material, as you can see, is probably the fastest draining soil. So rule of measurements: 1 inch you have sandy soil, 2 inches you're working with silt, and 3 inches you're working with a lot of clay. Another way to do a soil test is with a jar test. So as you can see, you throw maybe about 1/3 of a mason jar full of soil with 2/3 of water, shake it up, and then draw lines on the jar at different time points. And then you can see it starts to stratify, and then you can measure what the breakdown is from sand, silt, and clay. And then after about a minute, the sand will settle out. An hour, the silt will settle. And then in about 2 days, the clay will fully settle. And then the organic material will float to the top. So here's another way to test your soil, right? Basically seeing what's in there. And you can do a drainage test by digging a hole between 6 inches to a foot deep. Place a ruler or a yardstick in there at the bottom, and then fill the hole several times to saturate the soil. And then basically measure the time it takes for the soil to completely drain. And then another thing that folks often overlook, but I think is something that's interesting, is chemical testing in your soil. There's oftentimes cases where we don't really know what's going on in the soil or what kind of happened to the landscape beforehand, where there was pollutants dumped or lead or just something crazy that could be really messing up your chances for having a successful garden. And so there's some soil labs where you can get chemical testing for soil fertility and pH. Here's that resource. And then another place where you can get biological testing done for fungi, bacteria, and nematodes. This is especially important for folks that are growing food, but again, this is a cool resource for anyone growing things. And the reason that we get into this topic so deeply, soil, is because it's not just dirt. It is as important as the conditions of your yard, like whether how much shade, sun, rainwater you get. Like the soil food web is everything, right? Plants feed from the food web. Like they're taking in nutrients and water and minerals through the soil food web, right? They have these relationships with mycorrhizae that live within their roots, and they help pick up micronutrients. And, we have like earthworms that aerate the soil, and mammals that move the soil around and release nutrients. And this whole ecosystem, there's this whole subterranean ecosystem that is a huge reason why plants are successful. So understanding how your soil food web works and the conditions of your soil will go a long way in ensuring the success of your native plant garden. A couple ways to boost your soil health is through organic fertilizers, through inoculation with mycorrhizae, using composting, and then also using sheet mulch. And then one of the coolest things that's super techy or nerdy is using compost teas, which you can brew. And these are AACT, aerobically activated compost teas. This is a pretty cool thing, but pretty down the rabbit hole. So maybe you're already there, or maybe you'll get there one day. But compost teas basically are, it's basically like a protein shake for your garden, if you want to put it simply. So like I said before, water in the garden is a great way to attract birds. And there's a lot of different water features that I think are good for birds. When birds are bathing, you don't see them just like jump into like a super deep pond, like all these songbirds. Like, no, they're not doing that. They're cautiously coming down to a really shallow creek or rivulet, or a really slow section along a really shallow section of a river. And that's because they want to feel the bottom with their feet. And so these flat water features that are not very deep are excellent. So, and having running water also serves to attract the birds because they can hear it. And it also prevents mosquitoes from breeding. There's a lot of different styles. One cool one, if you don't have a lot of outdoor space or anything like that, is like a little dish with this thing called the water wiggler, which is just like you put a little battery in here and it oscillates and creates movement in the water, which deters mosquitoes from laying eggs in there. All right, so we went over kind of like most of the important things around garden maintenance and plant selection. But now it comes time to figure out where to get native plants, because if you go to Home Depot or you go to Lowe's, they don't have any native plants at all. I remember I went to one a couple years ago and I was asking about native plants, and they took me to the Australian plant garden. She tried to tell me that they were native plants. So these large corporations are not doing anything to help our local ecosystems. Obviously, they do play a role in our lives, of course, but California native plant nurseries that are dedicated to the propagation and education of native ecosystems and native plants are where y'all should be shopping if you want to purchase already grown plants. And on Calscape, you can basically find a nursery near you. So like I said, Calscape is a really cool website, and it's by the California Native Plant Society. Another thing that you can do is grow from seed. There's a lot of great ways to do that. They're low cost. It increases genetic diversity. It deepens individual connection to the plant life cycle and ensures your native plants aren't covered in pesticides and insecticides. And that may come as a surprise, but a lot of these commercial nurseries that are growing California native plants also spray their plants to keep bugs off of them. But unfortunately, bees and butterflies may encounter risks from the commonplace use of pesticides during plant production, which can leave residues on or in plants. And this is an article that's on the Xerxes Society website. It's an organization dedicated to conservation of invertebrates. So like I was mentioning before about plant selection, I tend to avoid cultivars. These are all different cultivars of sticky monkey flower, Diplochis auranticus. And so they're beautiful, but the natural genetics, in my opinion, are equally deserving of praise and should be planted in our gardens. This is the sticky monkey flower. This is red bush monkey flower. They are gorgeous. Let's see. That's old. Sorry about that. And just to review, California has such diversity. And one of the like hardworking, nearly year-round flowering all-stars in much of the state are buckwheats. This is California buckwheat. And like I talked about earlier with the yarrow, instead of just like each of these little pom-poms being one flower, it's actually what we call a composite head. Each of these are like maybe, I don't know, 75 flowers just in this little frame. And during the warmer months of the year, you can see, especially in the morning time, the buckwheats are just like buzzing with life. They're just covered with bugs and insects, which is sadly, I think a lot of people are turned off by bugs and insects, but as a bird watcher, I think everyone knows how important insects are for birds and the food web. So buckwheats are a really great place to start with as a host plant for insects. And we'll get into some of the variety of plants that we find in California. These are wild Canterbury bells. These are annuals for the most part. Stunning purple tube-like flowers, great for bumblebees. We have a variety of different poppies. We already talked about the California poppy. Here we have I think it's giant bush poppy or just bush poppy, Dendromecon rigida. And then we have several different species of Matilaha poppy. This is Coulter's Matilaha, and they're stunning, as you can see. And then again, talking about year-round benefits, right? So on the left-hand side, on the left and right, we have the same exact plant, just in different life stages. And on the left-hand side, this Ribes speciosum or fuchsia flowering gooseberry is in Grossularaceae family, Ribes and currants. And here they have these beautiful red tube-like flowers, which are loved by hummingbirds. And then like in the spring, they flower like this. And then in the early summer, they begin to after they get pollinated, they begin to fruit and they produce these delicious gooseberries, which provide food for things like black-headed grosbeak, western tanager, a lot of fruit-loving birds, towhees, things like that. We'll get into here and dive in. So the same plant provides food resources for several different species throughout its seasonal journey. So just wanted to really drive home that idea. And again, here's the Anna's hummingbird doing exactly what I said, feeding on the nectar from these flowers. And then maybe he could even, this adult female could even stop in and hawk an insect or two or a spider from this spider web. So it's all about creating ecosystems to support native plants and wildlife. And you can see here, this flower was pollinated not that long ago, and the ovary starting to get inflated, and it's starting to transition from a flower into a fruit. Here's the Anna's hummingbird sipping on some nectar from bladder pod. Again, it's all about regional appropriate plants. So this is one that's regionally appropriate in Southern California, and it flowers year round and is a really great plant for hummingbirds. I love Toyon. Toyon flowers in the winter. It's the only California native plant that has its indigenous name, Toyon. And as you can, and their berry production also coincides with thrush migration and overwintering habits throughout their range. So pretty cool, Toyons and robins. So here's an example of plants in Southern California, for example, that flower January through March, because we want to plant for year-round benefits, and plants that flower year-round are going, or plants that flower in distinct sections will be great for that, as well as plants that flower year-round. So we have the Allen's hummingbird and the golden currant. We have pink chaparral currant. We have a couple different opuntias. Here's a beaver tail cactus. Whoops. And then we have our couple species of monkey flower again. So these are generally start to flower January through March, depending on where you are. And in some cases, they can even be seen flowering like year round. And then getting into the traditional summer months is really when the salvias show up and show out. Here's, I think, purple sage or Cleveland sage, I always forget. But again, these are fantastic pollinator plants. You can make tea from the leaves, and they're just so aromatic and delightful, and a lot of insects and birds come to here. We have hummingbird sage, another salvia. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just kind of move along. But again, you can see really there's a lot of diversity in overall size, shape, and color with these flowering plants. And a question that I usually get is bird feeders. And there's a lot of different options for bird feeders. What I always say is bird feeders are a great thing to bring birds into the yard to initially attract them, but it should be your native plants are the reason that they stay. And everything from these squirrel buster feeders to hummingbird nectar dishes to, you know, tray feeders, window feeders, oriole feeders. They got feeders for every type of bird. And then another thing that's interesting is I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about native plant gardening, forget that some folks just don't have that kind of space. And so there are container gardening workshops so that you can plant in containers as well if you don't have the luxury of space of an outdoor space. And again, plants and insects form an inextricable relationship, and they are integral to supporting birds and other species of wildlife like lizards and things like that. So we want to plant regionally appropriate native plants to help reinvigorate insect populations locally, which will have trickled up effects on the rest of the food web. One of my all-time favorite plants is the black sage. I showed our sage a little bit earlier. As you can see, it's got these, whatever, they're in the mint family. They've got square stems and beautiful array of kind of light lavender to purple flowers. And this is like spring. They've got these really oily, deliciously smelling leaves like catnip. And then during the fall and winter, they form these seed pods that are filled with little tiny seeds. And you can oftentimes see little finches, like goldfinches, feeding on the seeds. And these are very closely related to chia, so you can consume them, put them in water. It's all good. So again, California has like 5,500 species of native plants. About 2,300 or so of them are endemic. And there's a stunning array, many that I obviously didn't cover tonight. But as you can see, California has its own spectacle of botanical beauty. And I would be remiss if I didn't share a little bit about oak trees. They are the backbone of California's ecology. we've lost maybe 1 billion or more oak trees, or several million oak trees in California. And for the last couple of falls, I've gone out and collected acorns to propagate them and donate them to local restoration organizations to help contribute to um, reforesting our landscapes. And as one of the most beloved birds in California is probably the acorn woodpecker. And so they obviously feed on oaks and acorns. And one of the best foresters in California is actually the California scrub jay. These birds are especially effective, especially in post-burn areas, where they'll head over to an oak tree that wasn't burned in the fall. They'll collect an acorn and then they'll stash it on the edge of the territory in kind of wet, loamy soil. And scrub jays have what's called spatial memory, and it's excellent. They remember like maybe 90% of the acorns that they bury, and they go back and they get them. But the 10% or so that they don't collect will eventually, they stand a good chance of germinating. So these scrub jays move like thousands of acorns around during the fall season, and you multiply that by how many scrub jays there are, they're really doing an incredible job of revitalizing the forest and ensuring its continuance. So again, this whole thing is about an ecosystem-based approach. We want to plant for year-round benefits with regionally appropriate native plants, plants that are from our like little eco zones and plants that belong here. And thanks for tuning in.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Benny. It was a
My
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you. We are going to enter the Q&A session now, so I'm going to go ahead and read some questions off. And one of the things that stood out to me that that I had been wondering about too, someone put in the chat, they talked about clay and hardpan being really common here in many of our backyards. And I'm wondering if you could kind of give us your thoughts on how we could approach this whole idea of putting native plants into our spaces when we have such a difficult contender in that hardpan that is really, really challenging.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not familiar what the term hardpan is. Is it basically just like super like hard, dense soil, basically just like super degraded? Okay, I think I'm answering my own question. When I think about the Central Valley, I think about like super gnarly clay, dry soil that's just like, I don't want to say devoid of life, but heavily degraded. Is that what hardpan is?
That's what it comes to my mind when I think of it. It's just this incredibly packed in clay, and at least from that's my understanding of it. If you've been to, have you been to the Forestier Underground Gardens by chance?
What's it called?
The Forestier Underground Gardens here. It's a local attraction in Fresno. No, okay.
No.
They have this whole it's a it's a famous landmark here in Fresno where this man from Italy came over and he encountered this really impossible soil when he was planning to come here to start his agriculture business and take that off. But he was so discouraged that nothing would grow that he ended up, instead of having money to build his own house, from what I understand, he started digging and sort of created a subterranean home, and much of the brickwork that he used, he actually chiseled out from the ground to make his structure, and most of the building is made from that. So anyway, back to the hard pan. That was just to kind of give you an idea. And so anyway, I was just wondering, could you kind of give us your suggestions on how we would deal with something like that?
That's a good question. Honestly, that's one I haven't gotten before and not one that I'm like super equipped to tackle. I think it's a really good question. I think ultimately what it comes down to is, and just off the top of my head, one is like understanding that the ecosystem that you live in, right? Like you can't fit a square hole into a round peg or whatever the saying is. Like I really hadn't heard much about hardpan, but from what I'm seeing right now, it's basically this super like it's basically underlaid by a rock hard layer material that's like close enough to the surface that basically limits the depth plant roots can extend, and it also prevents internal drainage of the soil. So it can basically make it really hard for things to grow. So I would I would my best suggestion would be to like reach out to someone, maybe like it looks like Valerie was saying at the Intermountain Nursery, who might have more like regional knowledge and experience on how to tackle some of these like challenging growing conditions. Because like I said, California is super diverse, and I know some stuff about some parts of my area, but I'm certainly by no means like an expert on all topics. But I would be curious to find out what the answer is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if you come across anything, we can actually go ahead and put it into the link once we get this up online for the future viewers who aren't able to attend today. We can go ahead and
Cool.
insert some links below and hopefully get that question answered, because I know for a lot of people that a lot of homeowners that I know, that's a real challenge when it comes to putting in plants actually into the soil instead of having like some potted things. So
Mm,
we can go to another question.
yeah,
Uh,
let's do it.
let's see. So for someone just starting out, let's see, how would you determine which native plants are best suited for creating micro ecosystems in different areas, like something like a yard? And I know you talked a little bit about those zones, but maybe you could kind of as a first time somebody who's just about to implement this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would do is go on Calscape and look at what is like in your zip code. Like look at what's in your zip code. And then look at shrubs and like annuals. Okay, let me rewind. The first thing I would do is go to an open space in your area that's like that's close by and similar kind of general habitat to where you live. Because what we do in the garden should mimic the natural patterns that we see in the ecosystems around us. So that's what, like when I think about stuff for, open spaces near me, or like the spot that I stay at, I think about what do I like in the ecosystems and like how do they connect with one another. So, that's like my folk spot. They have, a fountain that like they have like that like creates a lot of splash. And I was like, man, like a lot of plants are getting soaked out here. But I'd seen things like yerba mansa, things like crimson columbine. They like wet soil. And so I was like, all right, I did a little experiment to see how they would react to that kind of wetness. And the crimson columbine like flowered twice this last growing season in like direct sun in the summer. And so it's to me, that's like the first step in conceptualizing like what do you want to do with your yard? Like what do you want it to look like? Like what are some plants that you really like that grow in your area? And then I would make a list of those things that you like. And then I would go on Calscape and see what it says in terms of growing ease and compare the conditions that you have in your yard. Like, okay, do you have XYZ soil? And how does that like Venn diagram of, okay, this plant can't tolerate, like is intolerant of clay soils, but you have like, clay loam. So it's not like complete clay. So it's like, okay, how strong is that? How good of conditions is my soil and environment at home for supporting the plants that I'm interested in? So first step, go check out a spot that's similar to you, like from an ecological standpoint, and then make a list and kind of start to vision board like what you want it to look like. Okay, like, and you can also look at like other native plant gardens. Theodore Payne does like these like is like a native plant nursery, and they have like photos of people's gardens to get inspiration and things like that. And then the third would be like, what are some easy ones that are going to flower at different types of years? So I might make like a group that are like January through March, June through August, and then winter plants, and kind of group them around like that. But for me, like top 10 that I think like that could really do well in any garden, I would say are like any of the regional sages, whether it's black sage or white sage. They love the heat. They love like, medium to fast drying soils. They don't require a lot of water. They flower like crazy. So I'm a big fan of the sages. I love the yarrow. I love California fuchsia. I think manzanitas are a great thing for the yard. They provide like that natural framework. Again, they don't need a lot. So it's really just about like the soil, the hydrozones, and the amount of sunlight that your plant's going to get. And another thing that people don't think about is the position of the sun across the season, right? So like in the summer months, you might get like a ton of sun on your yard, and that's like your plants love it. And then in the wintertime, you might have a neighbor's tree or hedgerow, and like the sun just doesn't get high enough, or it's only overhead for a couple hours to get enough light on your plants. So these are some things that just like any naturalist or any observer of natural spaces would pick up on if you spend more time. So before you like rush into dumping time and money, spend a little time sitting in your yard during different times. Or I'm sure there's a bunch of techie resources to plot, using geometry or trigonometry or whatever to see how much sunlight your yard's going to get, so that you don't put in this time, money, or effort, and then you have like a super substantial loss of native plants. But one of the most common mistakes is just like simply overwatering. California native plants should they go from freezing snow to triple digits, so they're pretty badass. So you kind of got to beat them up a little bit to make them tough. You don't want them to get soft on you.
Awesome. So, what my last question that I'm going to pull up, because you have answered a few of these, like where to get them, and then what goes into considering. Uh, so some of the questions you've answered, but my last follow-up question would be like, what are your opinions on, let's say, if somebody wants to have native plants in their yard, but they don't want it to become just completely overgrown by, these what some would consider like weedy looking, and they want to have some, I guess, control over the yard maintenance, where they have like maybe some kids that they would like to hang out in this part where they don't want it to overgrow. What are your thoughts on, say, like potted plants, size of pots, and what could we do if we're thinking about that?
That's a really great question. So the first thing is, um, when possible, throw them in the ground. They're going to be happier. Um, and they also like, regular pruning to like be cut back. Like in some cases, for example, one plant that's super common in California and riparian river bottoms is mule fat. And in most cases, you see it just like scraggly and gnarly and just like almost like creating a tunnel on itself, because it's so poorly maintained, because indigenous people have basically been extirpated from the landscape. But indigenous people traditionally, and in some places where their cultural practices are still active, they'll basically coppice the plant back to the base of the plant, and then it will grow next year in these perfectly straight shoots, that are that they use for air to make arrows. They can also use it for like traditional fire making methods. So, and the same thing is true with certain grasses, that love mixed interval fires, that basically like burn them down and create this intermediate disturbance, and then it bolsters their growth. And so when you don't maintain plants, they tend to like go into degradation and not disrepair, but they can be more prone to like, virus and illness. I don't know, someone goes to the haircut and they're like, oh, I want to get a like stimulator tip. So you just like takes a little bit and it comes in nice again. You can be pretty drastic with California native plants every couple years, like cut them back and they'll just like come back like crazy and beautiful. So that's the first thing, is like, don't forget to maintain the garden. And then to answer the question directly around container gardening, I'd say that is a more challenging art. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it is more challenging. I do think the California Native Plant Society offers some workshops on container gardening, but for folks that have like the type of soil that you described, that hard pan, for folks that just don't have any outdoor space, maybe they live in an apartment or whatever, you can definitely still do cool container plants, if you practice, because they need a certain soil potting mix. It's a whole different science, but it's totally possible for sure.
Thanks. And it sounds like we could be forgiving of ourselves if there's some trial and error in the whole process with some things that might not do so well in a particular area of our garden. And not become discouraged and maybe just keep trying things until they take root.
Yeah. And I think that's a great takeaway. And I think I also try and circumvent it by setting us up for success like the best way possible. So there's these different ways like the soil testing, um, you know, professional labs and things like that. So, but it's true, it is going to be trial and error. You're not going to read one book or go to one workshop and you're now an expert in native plant gardening. Like people who have been doing this for years still are constantly learning and, getting better at what they do, learning how to companion plant more effectively, learning how to be more aggressive with pruning or just all of these different nuances. Just like if you were a farmer, right? Like your first year of farming versus your 10th year of farming, you're probably going to be a much more successful farmer and you're in the 10th year with all those 9 years behind you of experience. So I think the biggest thing you said is just having fun with it, connecting with the plants, getting outside of this just like hyper productivity mindset that I think a lot of us kind of get stuck in, and just like have fun and connect.
Thank you, Benny, again for your fantastic presentation and your wealth of knowledge for us who really want to bring in those native plants to our yard and do right by, our impact on the environment, including those birds who are native to this area. Um, if anybody if you'd like to check out Benny's social media, it's in the chat. How can we reach you, Ben, if you just want to shout out that really quick before we go?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so all of my info is on my website, birdsbybijs.com. And I also post a lot of like fun videos and a ton of photography on my Instagram. It's at Birds by Bee-jus. All you have to type in is Birds by Bee-jus on the internet, and sure as hell you will find me. But I'll just do one quick plug. I'm looking for folks who are interested in potentially joining me on a 12-day tour to Colombia. This is the last tour I've got with spots open for 2024. So that is going to be epic. All my tours are basically like all inclusive. All you have to do is get yourself there, and then 3 meals a day, private transpo. We have like high quality local guides. I operate as like a tour leader / co-leader, and it's great for birders who love photography. And next year I have 2 Costa Rica tours: Ecuador Northwest, Ecuador Amazon, Trinidad and Tobago for photographers, and then maybe one more, and then Jamaica in December. So we are we're having a good time this year and next year. So if you want to join me, love to have you. We have a good time. We talk about a lot of birds and tropical ecology. So if that's what you like, that's what we'll be talking about.
Yeah, I think you're speaking a lot of our people's language here. Thank you again very much, Benny. And if you guys want more information on that, reach out to him on his social media like he just described, on his website. And thank you again, Benny, very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Welcome to your new seat as president, and I hope everyone has a fantastic evening.
Likewise. Thank you.
Cheers.